The dimly lit war hall echoed with the hushed whispers of young alien recruits as they gathered around the towering figure of Commander Xelvar. His armor bore the scars of countless battles, deep claw marks, and plasma burns telling stories of wars long past. His piercing eyes scanned the eager faces before him, young warriors who had never seen true combat, who still believed war was about honor and strategy. They had heard of his victories, his legendary status among the Xelari military, but tonight they wanted something else. They wanted to hear about the one enemy that had haunted even the strongest warriors, the humans. The room fell silent as one recruit, voice trembling, asked, "Commander, is it true what they say? That humans are the most terrifying species in the galaxy?" Xelvar exhaled slowly, his mandibles clicking together as he stared into the distance, as if seeing ghosts from his past. "You have fought simulations," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "You have trained against holograms, studied tactics, and memorized strategies. But nothing in your training has prepared you for the horror of facing a human in battle." He leaned forward, and the young warriors felt an unexpected chill crawl up their spines. "Let me tell you about my first encounter with them. Let me tell you how I learned to fear them." His story began on the barren world of Drathos IV, where the Xelari Empire had sent an elite strike force to wipe out a small human colony. Intelligence had reported minimal resistance, simple farmers and engineers with outdated weapons. Victory was supposed to be swift. But when Xelvar and his soldiers arrived, the colony was silent, too silent. Buildings stood intact, lights flickered in windows, but there was no movement, no sound, not even the faint hum of machinery. "It was as if the colony had been abandoned," he said. "But we knew better. They were there, waiting." The first attack came without warning. A single shot rang out from the shadows, and the squad's lead scout dropped dead before he could even react. Then, from the rooftops, from hidden tunnels beneath the ground, from the very walls around them, the humans struck. "They did not fight like soldiers," Xelvar continued, his claws tightening. "They fought like ghosts, vanishing before we could return fire, reappearing only to strike again. They were not stronger than us. They were not faster. But they understood something we did not. War is not about honor. It is about survival." The young recruits exchanged uneasy glances. They had been taught that war followed rules, that soldiers fought with discipline and order. But humans, as Xelvar described them, sounded like something else entirely: predators who did not care for rules, only results. The battle dragged on for days, turning into a nightmare the Xelari had never experienced before. The humans used every trick imaginable, setting traps that turned corridors into death traps, using the environment to their advantage, exploiting the very instincts the Xelari relied on. "We lost half our forces before we even saw them properly," Xelvar admitted, his voice heavy. "By the time we understood what we were facing, it was too late." One recruit hesitated before speaking. "But surely, Commander, your forces outnumbered them. You had better technology." Xelvar let out a bitter chuckle. "Yes, we had numbers. We had technology. But humans, they had something else. They had desperation. And desperation makes them unstoppable." He then spoke of a moment that still haunted him the night he saw what true human resilience meant. A single human soldier, separated from his team, cornered in a ruined structure with no chance of escape. Xelvar's squad moved in, prepared to finish the fight. But instead of surrendering, the human pulled a blade from his belt, a simple combat knife, and charged. "We outnumbered him 10-1, Xelvar whispered, his eyes dark. Yet he did not hesitate. He did not show fear. He fought as though death meant nothing. The recruits leaned in, drawn deeper into the story despite the growing sense of unease. Xelvar's squad fired their weapons, but the human kept coming. Even as plasma scorched his armor, even as his body bled, he continued to fight, cutting through one warrior after another with brutal efficiency. "He should have died in seconds," Xelvar said. "But he didn't. He lasted minutes. And in those minutes, he killed half my squad." His mandibles clenched. He only collapsed when his body could no longer move. And even then, he was still trying to reach for his weapon. The room was deathly silent. The recruits, who had entered the hall full of excitement and curiosity, now sat rigid with an unfamiliar emotion fear. Xelvar studied their faces and leaned back, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You think this is an isolated story? It is not. This is humanity. They fight until they can fight no more. And even then, they will find a way to keep going. His claws tapped against the metal of his chair. You may believe yourselves ready for war. But I tell you now, if you ever face a human in battle, do not underestimate them. Because if you do, you will not live to regret it. One last recruit, his voice barely above a whisper, dared to ask. How did you survive? Xelvar looked at him for a long time. Then, slowly, he stood, his towering form casting a shadow over the recruits. I didn't, he said at last. The warrior I was died on Drathos IV. What remains of me is just a soldier who learned to fear. He turned and walked away, leaving the recruits in stunned silence. For the first time, they understood war was not about strength, nor was it about honor. War was about survival. And the humans. They had mastered it. Commander Xelvar had fought many battles, faced countless enemies, and conquered entire worlds, but nothing haunted him like his first encounter with humans. Even now, standing before the young recruits, he could feel the old fear creeping into his bones, the memory of that fateful mission still fresh in his mind. His soldiers had been elite, hand-picked warriors of the Xelari Empire, trained to crush any resistance with precision and discipline. Their target had been a small human colony on the distant world of Drathos, a seemingly insignificant settlement with outdated technology and no known military presence. Intelligence reports had assured them it would be an easy operation, a mere display of force to remind humanity of the Xelari's dominance. But as Xelvar stood on the bridge of his warship, staring down at the silent colony below, something felt wrong. The sensors detected no movement, no energy signatures, no signs of life. And yet, the settlement remained untouched, buildings intact, machinery still running, as if its inhabitants had simply vanished. It was too perfect, too still. Instinct warned him to proceed with caution, but the orders were clear: eliminate all human presence and secure the colony. His forces descended like a storm, armored warriors sweeping through the streets in tight formations, weapons ready. They expected panic, fear, perhaps even desperate resistance from civilians, but there was nothing. Empty homes, abandoned vehicles, half-eaten meals left on tables as if the occupants had disappeared mid-bite. The silence was suffocating. Xelvar ordered his troops to spread out, search every building, find anything that explained the eerie emptiness of the colony. That was when the first scream tore through the comms, a sound so raw and filled with terror that it sent a chill through even the most hardened warriors. A scout team had entered what appeared to be a communication center. Moments later, their vitals flatlined. No gunfire had been heard, no explosions, just silence, followed by death. Confusion spread through the ranks, unease growing like a disease. How could an entire squad be eliminated without a trace? Then, another scream, this time from the southern sector. Another squad gone. Panic started creeping in, discipline beginning to waver. Xelvar barked orders, trying to keep control, but the enemy remained unseen, striking without warning, vanishing without a trace. Then, the shadows moved. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the dimly lit alleyways, a shifting of darkness that should not have been possible. Then came the first real attack. A squad of 5 warriors, highly trained and fully armored, were patrolling a corridor between 2 buildings when the walls themselves seemed to come alive. Figures burst from hidden compartments, from tunnels beneath the ground, from rooftops above. They moved with terrifying speed, weapons flashing in the darkness, striking with precision. The Xelari barely had time to react before the humans were upon them, tearing through their defenses with ruthless efficiency. No energy weapons, no advanced technology, just simple ballistic rifle. Was dragged into the shadows, his screams cut short by the sickening crunch of bone. The humans did not fight like soldiers. They fought like predators. They did not stand their ground and exchange fire. They hit and vanished, struck from the darkness, used the very environment against their enemies. They fought to kill, not to survive. Xelvar tried to rally his troops, forming defensive lines, but the colony itself had become a trap. The humans had planned for this. They had studied Xelari tactics, anticipated every move, turned the terrain into a weapon. The moment his forces took position, explosions rocked the streets, buildings collapsing to separate squads, gas seeping from vents to blind and disorient them. Every attempt to regroup was met with another ambush, another squad wiped out before they could react. What should have been a simple operation had turned into a massacre. It was then that Xelvar realized the horrifying truth: this was never a colony. This was a battlefield, and the humans had been waiting for them. Desperation set in. He called for air support, but his dropships came under heavy fire from hidden turrets, weapons scavenged and repurposed from abandoned human vessels. Every attempt to retreat was cut off, every escape route sealed. Xelvar himself was nearly taken when a human soldier, covered in blood, both his own and that of the Xelari, lunged at him from the ruins of a shattered building. The human's eyes burned with something Xelvar had never seen in any enemy before. Not hatred, not fear, determination. A refusal to surrender, to accept death. Even as Xelvar drove his blade into the human's chest, the soldier grabbed his arm, pulling him closer, whispering words that still haunted him to this day. "You should have stayed away." The human died with a smirk, as if he had already won. By the time reinforcements arrived, half of Xelvar's forces were dead. The colony was in ruins, but the humans had melted away into the wilderness, vanishing like ghosts. There were no prisoners, no bodies left behind, only the lingering presence of an enemy that had turned an entire battlefield into their weapon. Xelvar had fought many wars, but nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the nightmare of facing humans. As he looked into the frightened eyes of the young recruits before him, he leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think war is about strength? You think it is about honor? Forget everything you have learned. Because the humans, they don't fight for victory. They fight to make sure you never forget them." And in that moment, as the recruits sat frozen in terror, Xelvar knew they finally understood. War was never the same after that first encounter. The Xelari Empire had faced many enemies, but none like humanity. And if the recruits ever found themselves on a battlefield against them, they would pray to whatever gods they believed in that they would not be noticed. Because if they were, there would be no escape. The battlefield was supposed to be silent. The Xelari had won. Their enemy lay in ruins, their forces crushed beneath superior firepower and precision. The city of Virex 9, once a proud human colony, was now little more than scorched metal and shattered glass. Smoke still curled into the air, carrying with it the stench of burning structures and bodies. The Xelari warriors moved through the wreckage, securing the last remnants of resistance, their weapons humming with cold efficiency. Commander Xelvar watched from a distance, his golden eyes scanning the destruction with a sense of finality. It had been a long battle, harder than expected, but the outcome was never in doubt. The humans had fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and overwhelmed. Their last stronghold had fallen. It was over. Or so he thought. Then the reports came in strange, fragmented messages from squads patrolling the lower sectors. A lone human had been spotted among the ruins. A survivor. But that wasn't what disturbed the Xelari. The reports were wrong. The human had been shot. Multiple times. And yet, he kept moving. At first, Xelvar dismissed it as exaggeration. Perhaps the warrior was simply injured, running on desperation, refusing to accept defeat. Humans were stubborn, after all. But then another report arrived. Another squad had engaged him. This time, they confirmed, multiple direct hits, energy blasts, blade wounds enough to bring down any living creature. And yet, the human had not fallen. Xelvar ordered the warrior to be tracked, but every attempt to corner him ended in disaster. The human did not flee. He fought. Alone, wounded, outnumbered, he struck with the ferocity of an entire battalion. He ambushed patrols, eliminating them one by one, vanishing before reinforcements arrived. He used the ruins to his advantage, moving like a phantom, striking from the shadows. The Xelari had fought many enemies, but none like this. A single warrior refusing to die. It made no sense. How could one being, battered and broken, keep going? The thought unsettled the commander more than he cared to admit. Finally, frustrated by the growing number of casualties, Xelvar led a strike team himself. They cornered the human deep within the ruins, in what had once been a command center, now a hollowed-out shell of twisted metal and shattered screens. The warrior stood there, breathing heavily, his body covered in burns and blood. His left arm hung uselessly by his side, his armor torn apart. Yet, as he turned to face the Xelari, his eyes burned with something terrifying. Defiance. The commander signaled his troops to hold. He wanted to see this creature up close, to understand what kind of being could defy death itself. "You are beaten," Xelvar said, his voice echoing through the ruins. "You should not be standing." The human chuckled a dry, painful sound. "I've heard that before." Xelvar studied him carefully. He should have been dead. No creature could withstand such wounds and remain standing, let alone fight. And yet, here he was, still breathing, still defying. The commander took a step forward. "Why do you fight? You know you cannot win." The human wiped blood from his face and smiled, teeth stained red. "Because it's not about winning." He took a shaky breath. "It's about making sure you remember me." And then, before Xelvar could react, the human moved. Fast. Too fast for someone in his condition. He lunged forward, taking down 2 Xelari warriors before they could even raise their weapons. The others opened fire, energy bolts tearing through him. But he did not stop. He did not fall. He fought like a creature possessed, like pain meant nothing, like death was just a suggestion. Xelvar watched in stunned silence as the impossible unfolded before his eyes. Even as his warriors struck him again and again, even as his body broke, the human kept moving, kept fighting, kept killing. He tore a weapon from a fallen soldier, turned it on his enemies, and kept pushing forward. His breath was ragged, his movements slower, but his determination never wavered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the human collapsed to one knee. He was dying. He had to be. But as Xelvar approached, the warrior lifted his head, blood dripping from his mouth, and grinned. "You'll tell them about me," he rasped. "You'll tell them what I did." Xelvar met his gaze, and for the first time in his long military career, he felt something foreign. Not fear, not anger, but respect. He had fought countless battles, faced powerful enemies, but never had he seen something like this. A single soldier who refused to die, who fought not for victory, but to be remembered, to leave a mark so deep that even his enemies would never forget. The human's breathing slowed. His body finally gave in. But the look in his eyes never faded. He had won in his own way. Xelvar turned to his soldiers, silent for a long moment before speaking. "Burn the city," he ordered at last. "Leave nothing behind." As the flames consumed Virex 9, as the Xelari ships departed, Commander Xelvar knew one thing for certain. He would never forget the human who wouldn't die. And neither would anyone else. The Xelari had always believed in superiority of numbers, of technology, of tactics. Their empire had crushed countless civilizations, reducing entire species to whispers in forgotten history. To them, war was a science, a predictable sequence of destruction that followed the same pattern every time. But then, they met the humans. And nothing made sense anymore. Commander Xelvar stood on the bridge of his warship, watching the vast human fleet before him. It was smaller, weaker, outclassed in every measurable way. And yet, the Xelari hesitated. Not because of the weapons, not because of the ships, but because of something far worse. A fear that had rooted itself deep within their ranks. A fear that came from the humans themselves. The battle had not even begun, and already his soldiers were uneasy, gripping their weapons too tightly, their movements stiff. They had faced humanity before, and they had learned one undeniable truth. Humans did not just fight wars. They waged something far worse. Xelvar remembered the first time he had seen it. A simple skirmish on a distant colony world. The humans had been outnumbered 20-1. Victory had been inevitable. And yet, his soldiers had hesitated. Not because of resistance, but because of something else. The enemy had not fought like soldiers, they had fought like ghosts, using fear as a weapon sharper than any blade. His troops had found messages scrawled in blood on the walls of ruined cities. "We see you." They had heard laughter in the darkness, voices whispering through their comms, mocking them, taunting them. Supplies went missing. Patrols disappeared without a sound. The Xelari had not been fighting an army. They had been hunted. It was worse than any war Xelvar had ever fought. His soldiers had been elite, fearless, trained to kill without hesitation. And yet, after weeks of silence and shadows, they had broken. They had started seeing things, jumping at shadows, turning on each other. Some had abandoned their posts, claiming they heard breathing in the walls. Others had woken up screaming, their minds shattered by unseen horrors. It was psychological warfare beyond anything the Xelari had ever imagined. And it was all human. When the final battle came, his soldiers had fired wildly into the night, shooting at phantoms that weren't there. By the time the humans actually attacked, they found a broken, terrified enemy. A force that should have been invincible had crumbled before a handful of human soldiers who had done nothing but make them afraid. And now, standing on the bridge of his ship, Xelvar knew the same thing was happening again. The human fleet was waiting, not attacking, not moving, just waiting. His soldiers had heard the stories. They knew what was coming. The whispers had already started. The crew reported strange noises in the halls, shadows moving where they shouldn't. A technician had gone missing, only to be found hours later, curled into a ball, muttering something about them watching. No one knew how it was happening. No one could explain it. But the humans didn't need to fire a single shot. They had already won. Xelvar clenched his fists. He had fought many battles, conquered countless worlds. But he could not fight an enemy that lived in the minds of his soldiers. He could not destroy a weapon that was not made of metal, but of fear. And in that moment, he understood. The humans had created something far deadlier than any fleet, any army, any bomb. They had created the ultimate psychological weapon. And it was them. The Xelari warship drifted through the darkness of space, silent and lifeless. A vessel that had once been filled with proud warriors, its corridors now echoed with an eerie emptiness. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the metallic walls. Something had happened here, something far worse than a simple battle. Commander Xelvar, the last surviving officer aboard, moved cautiously through the desolate halls, gripping his weapon with white-knuckled hands. His breath was ragged, his mind fraying at the edges. He had seen what happened to his crew. He had heard their screams through the comms. And now, he was alone. It had started as a routine engagement, a final stand against the humans. The Xelari fleet had been weakened, their forces broken by months of relentless human resistance. But this time, they believed they had the advantage. Their ships outnumbered the enemy 3-1. Their technology was superior. Their battle strategy was flawless. Yet, as the final confrontation approached, something had shifted. The humans did not attack as expected. They simply waited, watching, a silent force lurking in the vastness of space. And then, one by one, the Xelari ships began to go dark. No explosions, no weapons fired, just silence. Entire crews vanished, ships left adrift like empty husks. The fleet crumbled without a single shot being fired. Xelvar's ship had been the last to fall. It started with whispers, voices echoing through the halls, speaking in a language he did not understand. The crew dismissed it at first, blaming stress, exhaustion. But then, the hallucinations began. Figures moving in the darkness, shadows that didn't belong. Crew members reported seeing their own reflections move out of sync, their own faces staring back at them with hollow, knowing smiles. Panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers turned on each other, screaming about intruders that no one else could see. And then, they started disappearing. One moment, they were there; the next, they were simply gone, their weapons clattering to the floor. Xelvar had tried to maintain order, tried to convince himself it was all a trick, some human psychological warfare. But now, as he walked through the corridors littered with abandoned weapons and flickering monitors, he could no longer deny the truth. There was something on this ship, something that should not be here. He reached the control room, gripping the edges of the console as he tried to send a distress signal. Static filled the screen. And then, a voice calm, cold, human. "You're the last one." Xelvar's blood ran cold. He turned sharply, weapon raised, but the room was empty. He tried to respond, but his throat was dry, his voice caught in fear. "You fought well." The voice was closer now. "But it's over." The monitors flickered, and for a brief moment, he saw them, humans, standing in the halls of his ship, watching him through the cameras. They should not be here. The ship had been sealed. There was no way for them to board. And yet, there they were, smiling. He spun around, but no one was there. His hands trembled as he took a step backward. The Xelari had always believed in strength, in firepower, in tactical supremacy, but the humans had never needed those things to win. They had found a different way. A way to break their enemies before a single battle even began. And now, as the last Xelari aboard his ship, Xelvar understood. He had not lost a war. He had been hunted. The lights flickered one final time, and the whispers returned, countless voices murmuring his name, surrounding him, suffocating him. He raised his weapon, but deep down, he knew it was useless. The humans had already won. And then darkness.